Oh, thank you so much, Keith. Adam and I love doing the next right thing here on Morning Joy. And I know that we're focusing a lot on a new school year, Adam. Everybody going back to school, going back to college campuses, even our young adults, first time ever leaving home and being there on campus at a new college, new experience, new surroundings. But Adam, the reality is that we've heard this many, many times, especially in religious education, that even on Catholic campuses, our young adults, our children will go off to college. We're excited about them exploring and showing their independence and being there and studying the things that they love. And then they come back for winter break. And all of a sudden, they're questioning how they were brought up. Why do we go to church? How come we have to go every single Sunday? I don't know if I believe this. I'm having different views. There's different things that I'm encountering at school, and everybody doesn't feel the way that we were raised in our Catholic Christian household. Adam, it's a problem. We face it. I know I did when my kids went off to college. It's a tough situation to be in as a parent because you think you have properly formed and helped them and catechized them and signed them up for all the classes, did everything at home you could possibly do. They go off to college, they come back a whole different person. You want to start there?
Sure, Deb. So, yeah, it's almost a truism, and I think this is very likely true in all religions that, in our 20s, particularly when we go away to college, we usually drift in question, and then a lot of people come back to their religion, in their 30s, maybe when they're getting married, or maybe later in life when they start facing mortality and they kind of go back to their roots. That's kind of a common thing. When I was in training for clinical psychology, I have my master's in adult clinical psychology. The rule of thumb that they taught us was, of course, we grow up with our parents and our family system, and we learn what we learn from them. And then we basically spend the decade of our 20s figuring out who we are separate from our parents, meaning we try to find our own identity, our own way in life, our own career that we want to pursue versus maybe what our parents wanted us to pursue. And then we spend the decade of the 30s building that life. And by the 40s, we're basically settled into that life and hopefully successful in it. And then we ride that out, for the rest of our years. So the 20s, we know the teens are a rough time because kids are starting to individuate from their parents and figure out their own identity. But then when they move away, there's, even less influence from the parents. And there is a certain natural process of wanting to explore and ask questions. I would say that the key point there would be to have access to really good, solid information so that when things are challenged, instead of just saying well, Sally seems really impassioned and she had a lot of good arguments and made sense to me when I heard it. And you can kind of fall for things that maybe aren't actually substantial, but maybe somebody's just a good orator, they're good at speaking, or they're passionate, and we can get drawn into things even though they aren't actually well supported, particularly if we haven't been involved in those kind of discussions. So I think having an access to a good place to go to say okay, well, this person's challenging Mary, or they're challenging the Eucharist, or they're challenging God, and they're making an argument for atheism. Having a good solid place to go to at least check those against the faith that you were raised in a good solid way would really, really help a lot of times. A lot of us have already been through college, and it is a time of questioning and learning new things and figuring out what we want to do in life. And a lot of people come back to their faith, as we said, but some don't, and some really get caught up until later in life. I've seen a lot of that, people that are in older age, they're facing mortality, and they want to quickly get themselves in order, which is, that's good. It's not like a bad thing to get yourself in order. But there's a lot of spiritual growth that was missed, a lot of opportunity for journeying closer and closer to Christ over those years that could have benefited them. So that would be my 2 cents, Deb, is there's a certain amount of this that's natural, and we have to expect it. But because we know it's natural and we expect it, let's give them really solid tools. If they had a Rolodex to go to something that nobody's ever heard of that they could flip through and go to that topic, through YouTube or really qualitative or quality speakers, not necessarily people just giving their opinions.
Right.
For me, that, I've never gone into other faiths. I became lax in later college and graduate school, like a lot of people do. I was really caught up in the rigors of graduate school. And I never really fell for anything else so much. But it would have been really helpful to have a quality teacher to answer those questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that we need to prepare our children. We need to prepare our young adults as they go into the world, really show their independence, encounter people of all faiths, all backgrounds, very different from maybe how they grew up. Maybe they're even sharing a dorm with somebody who was brought up very differently. So they need to be prepared. They need to be equipped. They need to be have the resources at their fingertips where they can explore and understand and defend and explain the faith in a calm, rational way. So I hear you saying that, but then I also, well, let me first ask you: was I correct in what I was hearing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I would, the only thing I would add, Deb, that I didn't mention is there's great value, I think, in finding resources for them that isn't their parents, because they're individuating. They're looking for other voices and other answers. But if like, I'm thinking of some of the podcasts out there, the really good ones, some of the talks that EWTN has produced, some of the Ascension, Ascension, is it Press? Father Chris Alar he did an Explaining the Faith series on YouTube. That's just a wealth of knowledge, and you can do a search topically there. Hearing from authoritative voices and being like, okay, I'm struggling with finding my own identity separate from my parents. Okay, here's somebody that's not my parents, but wow, they're really bright and well informed. This makes sense to me. That's, I think, where a real strength for them could come.
Well, and let's go back to Father Chris Alar, Explaining the Faith. When he did a two-part series on the Mass, that was golden. That was amazing. And that, I think, is very, very important for our young adults, because one of the things that I have noticed in ministry work is when they come back from their first break of college, they start to question why they have to go to Mass. That's one of the key discussions that happen at home. I know, because a lot of parents will come. When I was working at the church, a lot of parents would come to the church really frustrated and say, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to get them? They're adults now. I can't drag them out of bed. I can't. And so understanding fully all the details, all the elements of the Mass will help them start to realize why they need to be at Mass. And rather than just when they get home, well, you're under house rules, so we're going to take you to Mass. You're home for break. We're going to Mass. That doesn't always cut it with because they're just waiting to go back to school, and then they can do what they want to do whenever they feel like they want to do it. So it's an interesting thing, Adam, and it goes back to I've said this so many times, and some parents have actually said to me, well, Debbie, I don't want to paint every encounter, every scenario, every situation they're going to face. I don't want to give them all the negatives. And I tend to disagree with that line of thinking, because I think when they're going into battle, Adam, the world is telling them that God doesn't exist. The world is telling them you can be your own mini God. The world is telling them do whatever feels good. Use your emotions to guide you. And that's dangerous. So I do think we need to, just like you would prepare a military person for battle, why not prepare people spiritually for battle?
Yeah. I mean, and do your best to give that to them. In the past we've talked about, the kind of like a spiritual first aid kit, or a spiritual medical kit, the equivalent of a first aid kit, could be really, really helpful, because I think, the difference maybe between when we went through, the college experience in the early 1900s, for myself, it feels like, and now, is that the kind of dark occult stuff is actually very present and available. So like when I went through, the college experience, the new crazy stuff of the world was more, just that alcohol was available and people are experimenting with all kinds of stuff, and there's a lot of promiscuity going on at the school, and you were exposed to just basically the world. But I think now, because witchcraft is becoming so normalized, and increasingly, Satanism is trying to become normalized, there's an extra level of challenge where it's not just falling into sin, but you can fall into some really dark stuff.
It's very different. You're right. What we encountered going to college was maybe some drugs, possibly alcohol, and partying a little too much. Okay, now our children are exposed to, hey, Adam, our friends are having a tarot reading session, or we're having we're gonna play with a Ouija board, or we're gonna do. And what are these young adults supposed to say all the time? No, I cannot attend that. No, I don't want to be part of that. No, you are my friends, but our church doesn't believe that. I mean, these kids are in these really difficult situations because now but they're saying to their friends, but there's no drugs there, there's no alcohol, there's no anything. We're just gonna predict the future. What do you say to parents that these kids are dealing with this on a regular basis?
It's tough, and it's part of why I think God has opened the way for us to do things like this radio show and the Spirit World show that we do, is a chance to educate particularly young people about the realities of these, that they're violations of the first commandment, that it's strongly forbidden in the Bible for good reason, that angels and demons are real, and you're entering into these relationships with these fallen angels by doing these practices, trying to seek dominion over time by knowing the future, or space and knowing remote information, or influencing other people through magic. There's kind of a base of this, Deb, that maybe in this segment we can talk a little bit about, and that is something really common in college life. I think in our generation, but more so now, and that is the postmodern idea of there is no objective truth. There's only subjective truth. It's my perspective, my worldview is correct for me, and yours is correct for you, and there is no objective truth. And it's essentially the I'm spiritual but not religious, usually meaning I don't follow any rules. I just tell myself I'm a good person, no matter how selfish and awful I'm actually being in reality. If I were to look at myself from the outside, I just tell myself I'm a good person and I'm good to go with God and He understands. And it's the spiritual but not religious kind of lazy rationalization of our behavior, because we don't like rules. We don't like objective rules. We don't want the 10 Commandments. We think it's limiting us, but no, it's actually protecting us. They're kind of guide rails to keep us from falling into a darkness that is kind of like quicksand. So part of the postmodern view that's so common in college life is, again, just this, my subjective truth is my truth, and it's equally valid as your subjective truth, or if there was such a thing as objective truth, well, that doesn't count. Mine, I create my own world. And this is exactly Genesis. This is why probably God gave us the story of Genesis and the lie that we can become like God. Because if you're going to say you're going to define the universe based on your perspective and your ideas, you're playing at God, but of course you're not God. And no matter how much you believe you can fly without the aid of an airplane or other things like a balloon, you're not going to float up in the air. Unless you're a saint who's levitating and that's 1 in billions, or a possessed person that's levitating and that's 1 in billions. But, those are with essentially the aid of spiritual forces outside of yourself. So you can't change reality just by believing it. There is objective truth, there is physics and all of that. And in the spiritual world, there is objective truth that we cannot change just by believing otherwise.
So, Adam, I'm not trying to challenge you, but I'm just trying to paint different pictures, because I think it's an important use of the Next Right Thing segment. I think there's no accident to this. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in September, Beetlejuice is going to be continued, the movie Beetlejuice in September. And so you've got your kids, going to school, and their friends go, "Hey, Adam, let's all go see Beetlejuice this weekend." It's harmless. It's fun. We're not doing anything. We're just going to the movies. So I think it leaves our young adults in a really terrible situation, because if they go because, yes, I'm doing some good things, I'm not getting involved with alcohol and partying and all drugs and all sorts of things, I'm just going to the movies, but they're going to see a questionable movie like Beetlejuice, because there's things in there that are definitely not in alignment with what we believe as Catholic Christians. They're faced with this problem, this dilemma, and that's probably why I would guess that they come home and then they start to say, "Oh, the devil's not real. That's silly. It was just a movie." And so, what do you say to parents and to young adults that are listening to this program right now? Because this is just a common thing that's going to continue to happen.
Yeah, so there's a few layers to this in the about 3 minutes we have left. We need to recognize that what we put into our senses does affect us. So many saints have talked about this, guarding your senses. What you put in your mind and your memory is there for good, and it will continue to affect us. And the way to maybe see this is if we take a straw man argument and we say, okay, what if you were to watch, the most awful films for 6 hours a day for weeks on end? You would say, like, well, yeah, you're going to be having nightmares. It's going to bother you. You're going to be anxious and probably moody. It's going to have an impact on you. If you imagine doing that 6 or 8 hours a day for weeks on end, and it's these really awful films, some of the really nasty stuff. So if we can acknowledge by common sense that if we were flooded with these movies, it would affect our mood and our thinking and get into our dreams, well, then we have to recognize that even watching one movie is going to a little bit affect us, because if a little bit of the same medicine that would poison us if we took too much of it, or a little bit of the poison is also going to affect us. So that would be point number one. So no matter what we say, it is going to have some impact. Point number two is that there's often an agenda behind the writing within movies. Hollywood, unfortunately, has a lot of the occult in it, a lot of occult practitioners, a lot of people that are members of different secret societies. I'm not talking about the Illuminati, typical conspiracy stuff you see about music videos, though there are people that claim to be members of that. It's just using an old label to get legitimacy. But let's take a common film that, it's well known because Dan Aykroyd talked about it. Go back to Ghostbusters. Film everybody knows. Who you going to call? Ghostbusters. Well, Dan Aykroyd, and I'm not criticizing him, I'm just saying these are the facts. He grew up in a spiritualist family. His father was really into spiritualism and table tipping and all the mediumship. And he said in interviews that he wrote and made Ghostbusters to normalize spirits and the spiritualism by putting it in the context of comedy.
Right.
And what did we see in the generation after that movie is the new wave of the paranormal craze came in.
Absolutely.
So, movies have agendas.
Well, and so next right thing, suggest a different activity, like go out for a nice meal or go for a walk or do something that is beneficial for your mind and body, as opposed to going to these entertainment situations which can put you in harm's way. Okay, Adam, we're going to have to hold it there. I wish we had longer for the next right thing, but we don't. So we're going to send it back to Keith for the rest of Morning Joy.